You know, we've explored nearly every single nook and cranny this tired old resort town has to offer, and even though we're damn close to ending our little journey, I can't help but feel like there's still some fresh pavement to kick. Kind of like our time here isn't up just yet. Besides, maybe what's really needed is a new perspective, a fresh platform that might allow us to get a different angle on this issue. So if you guys will join me, I think we might get a little reading done today. Ladies, gentlemen, welcome to Silent Hill. Silent Hill Book of Memories was yet another event brought about by Konami wanting a new SH game on the market, but not so much that they're willing to do it themselves. The guidelines were relatively simple, if not a little blasphemous. They wanted an SH game designed from the ground up for PlayStation's Vita handheld, and was different every time it's played, with an emphasis on multiplayer. Not exactly bad goals to have for any normal game, but Silent Hill is no normal series. WayForward Games would be the developer that rose to meet this challenge, but the community was split on this news, as it meant Tom Hewlett would once again be at the helm for a Silent Hill game's development. Now, it's important to mention that he was getting a crazy amount of hate at this point, and regardless of what side of that debate you're on, I think we can all agree a mass amount of spam, insults, and actual threats are not the best way to express those grievances. Hell, even I'm guilty of getting pissed and popping off at the mouth during my HD collection video, but that being said, I can understand the fans being, at the very least, a little apprehensive about Tom's return to the series. After all, regardless of whether or not you think it was his fault, he had been involved in some of the worst moments in the series' timeline. People assumed that this would be a similar situation, and maybe it was, but this time I don't think a lot of the blame can rightly land at Tom's feet. Konami had a very specific set of goals they wanted this game to meet, and at no point could any studio have created a traditional SH game under those conditions. I mean, you can't exactly have an atmospheric, slow-building panic attack while mashing the attack button from a top-down perspective while another player is running around in your field of view. Say what you want about how appealing that might be as a gameplay strategy, but there's just no way those ingredients could add up to the type of Silent Hill experience we all wanted at the time. So as we go on, you'll likely have a much easier time if you keep in mind that this will not in any way, shape, or form even resemble an honest-to-goodness SH game. I think the best way to approach this is like you're playing a spin-off in the series universe. And that being the case, we may need to alter our expectations just a little bit, which I guess is a good way of moving on to this game's story, what little of it there is to move on to.
I mentioned playing tennis. Is there anything else you're into?
Well, I'm a dancer, but I keep that on the down low.
At the start of BM, that means bowel movement. Let's try that again. At the start of BOM, you're going to get your longest and most straightforward piece of story in the entire experience. You take on the role of your custom-created character as they hang out in their kind of dingy, rundown apartment. After a knock at the door, we find that the mailman from SH Downpour has arrived with a package addressed to us, and hailing from the town of Silent Hill no less. Now, I hate to be a dick this early in the process, but does it feel a little odd to any of you that the game's trying to get us to believe the town of Silent Hill has now become sentient and understands how to use the US postal system? I mean, people have often been drawn to the town in the past, but that was always left vague and unaddressed as to not subtract from the mystery and relative believability of the games. To put it a little more concisely, Silent Hill works best when it's an abstract concept for people to manipulate of their own volition. In Part 1, the town's ancient spiritual power was being corrupted by Cheryl's inner torment, helped along by her strong psychic powers. In 2, James shows up to find his dead wife and ends up populating the town with his own mental hang-ups. And of course, the third game had Heather going through a similar situation as her hatred and negative emotions caused her to manifest these things into the real world using that same spiritual power and a little bit of good old-fashioned help from a developing elder god inside of her. And if you didn't catch the single thread tying all these situations together, essentially the town of Silent Hill just provides you with a can of gas, but you're the one who has to light it, often with a match made up of your worst traits. In Book of Memories, the town acts with purpose and manipulates situations far outside the reaches of its power. I don't know, there's just something about the starting point that rubbed me the wrong way, but then again, we are supposed to judge this as a spin-off, so I guess it's fair, kind of. Once our character opens their package, they find a book inside that has listed in it every memory they have ever had, and for some reason the first thing that comes to their mind is altering the events laid out in the book.
What happens if I rewrite it?
So after some actual life hacking, they pass out, and upon waking up find themselves in a kind of nightmare trying to pass itself off as the other world. After a little exploration, we come across good old mailman Howard, who also runs a store inside the other world. Setting aside how lame of a concept that is for now, Howard goes on to explain that what we're attempting to do is change our past by altering the events in our book of memories, and to do it we need a substance called memory residue. And no, you are not the only one who finds that to be very, very dumb. So after finishing the dungeon, we wake up to find that the alterations we make in the book seem to come true after finishing these nightmares. So the rest of the story in the game follows this alter the book, finish the dungeon flow, and I guess it's not the worst thing in the world. After all, this is a dungeon crawler. There weren't a whole lot of other options that would give us an in-game explanation for why we have to keep endlessly completing dungeons. So we'll give it a little pass there, but for me the real issue is the way the rest of the story is told to the player. From here on out, kiss cutscenes and direct storytelling goodbye for good, because literally everything we'll learn from here on out will be delivered through seemingly mundane notes left around chronicling insignificant events in the lives of characters we've never met before. Like not getting along with a coworker or having a sibling that's having an affair. And I know what you're thinking. How does this tie into Silent Hill or any of the themes present in other games? Well, see, that's the thing. How should I put this? It does not do that. There we go. That's right, and things getting easier every day. Right up until the very end of the game, this isn't a story about changing past events in your character's life. It is strictly about those events. You'll find notes talking about things that are happening in your character's life, like upcoming promotions or personal drama, but none of these things lead to an overarching plot that deals with the town or the power that allows you to do these things. About 90% of the story that you'll have told to you throughout the entirety of this playthrough will be characters you've never met in the game gossiping about other characters you've never met in the game. And it's not even good gossip, it's, hey, did you hear that guy got fired? There are notes that go into the creation of the book and mention the town's cult maybe once or twice, but the vast majority of the game's story will have you reading and listening to events and conversations that have no real significance or meaning to the overall plot of the game. You can go into your menu and read all these unrelated notes in order to get a more full idea of the story, but that didn't make this any more palatable for me. Now, to be clear, there is an overarching story that has to do with your character and their struggle to justify using their book like this, but that story starts and ends with the final few dungeons in the game.
The book is too dangerous. You have to be destroyed.
So from the start to the finish, it's side stories for you, but they're just not interesting or meaningful enough to keep me interested. There are multiple endings to consider, and that is always a nice inclusion, but thanks to the gameplay required to qualify for these endings, they're a little less of a reward for decisions made in the game, and more like events triggered by things only someone looking to purposefully manipulate the game would be able to trigger. Kind of like having a normal ending and then one that only a world record speedrun would be able to unlock. I assume it's clear by now that I just didn't like this story, but not for the reasons I normally do. It's not like it's a bad story, it's that there isn't much of a story here at all. Sure, there are things going on in the game and those things are delivered to you as if they were story, but the vast majority of these things are little personal dramas and events that don't mean much of anything. And this is going to sound like a joke, so I want to make it very clear up front that I am not exaggerating. You could get a similar narrative experience to this game by just asking your significant other how their day at work was today. No joke, this is one of the most simple narratives I have ever experienced in a video game. Character gets booked, then changes past, then figures out changing past has repercussions, and depending on what arbitrary things took place inside the game's randomly generated dungeons, you'll get one of 6 endings to that scenario. Boom. Whole story over, right there. Like I said before, I did not expect this to be a traditional SH story, so I didn't hold it up to that metric, and I know the limitations of Konami's instructions made telling any story at all a little challenging, but what we're left with here is almost non-existent. And most important of all is the vehicle by which all of this narrative is delivered, which is primarily text logs and audio of conversations you're not involved in coming through TVs.
Yeah, you're super pretty.
I thought so.
Of course, it's not uncommon to have SH games tell the player key elements with notes that can be found, but the major difference is in those games, there's also a story that is told via other means. most importantly by your character interacting verbally with other people. With BOM, we have an intro cutscene and an ending. These will be the only 2 times in the game where story will be delivered outside of a letter, and if you ask me, that's just not satisfying. So I guess if you come into this with the expectation that there will be no story, you might be pleased with the very little that's on offer, but I sure as hell was not. Here's hoping the gameplay fares a little better.
I don't know anybody in Silent Hill.
You'd be surprised. Life moving so fast these days. People end up all kinds of places.
Gameplay in Book of Memories is relatively easy to describe. This is a dungeon crawler, and the emphasis was for players to be able to continue playing the game even after they've beaten it. And on the surface, that sounds okay. Hell, one of my favorite things in the world to do is boot up a Japanese dungeon crawler like Shiren the Wanderer or Chocobo Dungeon and spend an hour or 2 making progress in some randomly generated grid-based dungeon. So I'm definitely not adverse to the idea of this kind of approach. Sadly, I just don't think the guys at WayForward were able to craft a gameplay loop that kept the game interesting after a few dungeons. But before I crucify it, let's go over the more objective stuff. All of your actual playtime will either be spent in dungeons or choosing which dungeon to enter. This means there will be no prep work that goes into taking on the next challenge. Once inside of a dungeon, there will be one and only one series of events for you to accomplish every single time. First, you talk to Valtiel to receive some sort of side goal like killing a specific enemy or finding a certain item. Then you explore the dungeon, filling in the map as you go while fighting a roster of monsters that reads like a greatest hits of the series up till now. While doing that, you'll come across puzzle pieces and then you'll have to solve the puzzle at the end of the dungeon. Boom, every single dungeon you go through will be this every single time. On the plus side, combat can be relatively satisfying, with the only real depth coming from you choosing to use either one slow weapon in both hands or 2 faster ones in each hand. Killing enemies will often net you a resource that is only necessary for getting a specific ending and a few other choice things, while items, weapons, and the game's currency can be found in dressers, pots, and other hiding spots. And since you're probably going to want to know where these things are at a glance, turning on your flashlight will highlight these containers with a nice shade of red. Some rooms will have blue orbs that once shattered will trigger a few monsters to spawn in, and the game tries to trick you by including conditions with these fights, but in reality, the only condition you will ever see is the standard defeat the enemy. Sometimes they may put a time or health limit on you, but this happens so rarely I'm not even sure I have recorded footage of it. After clearing these challenge orbs, you'll get a key item that needs to be used in the puzzle at the end of the dungeon. The number of these puzzle items you'll need will be displayed on the lower left hand side of the screen, and once you get them all, you'll need to solve what can be generously called a puzzle. The approach to these puzzles was outlined by WayForward as a kind of distillation of every SH puzzle. They essentially broke down all of the head scratchers in the series and distilled them down to their base elements, also known as simplifying them to hell and back. This approach was outlined by WayForward as a kind of distillation of every SH puzzle. They essentially broke down all of the head scratchers in the series and simplified them down to their most base elements. So at the end of every single area in the game, you'll need to arrange items in some kind of order. Whether it's by color, shape, or size, always expect to put a collection of items in some kind of plane. After 3 zones, you'll have to fight that area's boss, and even though these guys had relatively recognizable patterns, I actually really enjoyed these fights. Beating the area's boss means continuing on to the next zone, this time with a different theme. Through dungeons, you'll randomly come across notes that'll give you a little exposition or sometimes a clue letting you know how to solve or arrange the puzzle items at the end of the dungeon. On top of that, there are these rooms that you'll rarely come across, and I honestly have no idea what function they serve. Most of the time, they will have you just sitting there and experiencing some kind of unrelated story having to do with random people, but sometimes there will be some kind of action to take, like playing hide and go seek with this ghost girl. How you interact with these events will align you to a good, bad, or in the middle kind of spectrum, and I really and truly have no idea what this does. I have to imagine it affects your ending, but I kind of thought your karma alignment and the notes you collect fill that role, so your guess is as good as mine. Being an RPG, there is an experience system and stats to dump points into, and some of these stats will affect how well you handle certain weapons, but not to any noticeable degree, I assure you. Instead of armor, you have artifacts that up some stats, and while it's very shallow compared to what a fan of these kinds of games might be into, I still appreciated its inclusion. Because modern Silent Hill games seem to be under some kind of government mandate, we have the return of breakable weapons, but at least this time around an item can be found or purchased that can restore a weapon to full stamina. The only issue with this being later sections of the game have enemies with HP so high, you'll have to nearly break a weapon just to get through a single room, and this means heading back to the shop to stock up on tools. Of course, you could just pick up the random weapons lying around a dungeon or the ones dropped by enemies, but these are almost always going to be weaker than the endgame stuff you already have, so you'll get locked into this constant cycle of grinding for EXP and returning to the shop. But you're rarely awarded money after defeating enemies, so you'll eventually come to a point where you just can't progress without returning to lower level areas just to get quick cash. And while I can admit I do enjoy the odd bout of grinding in my RPGs, this game takes it to a whole new, really nasty level. This is because enemies give you next to no experience. After more than 20 hours of gameplay, I might have been at level 18. If you ask me, there is a lot of balance and quality of life updates needed here before Book of Memories earns itself a spot next to the other more quality-driven titles in the genre. Book of Memories occupies this really odd spot as a game, since it's supposed to be an SH game, so there are things included to indulge fans of that series. It's also supposed to be a dungeon crawling RPG, but the stated goal was to make a dungeon crawler that non-fans of the genre could get into, and to me this meant simplifying everything down to their most shallow elements. And believe me when I say that they accomplished this goal very successfully. So this means not only fans of dungeon crawlers won't be into it, but SH fans will likely not be interested in stepping so far outside survival horror. This leads to a game that wanted to please everyone, but instead kind of made itself unappealing to everyone. It kind of goes like this. If you're looking for the psychological horror that got you into the series, I doubt very much this kind of an RPG will be very high up on your list of potential SH experiences. And if you enjoy these kind of RPGs, there will be a nearly infinite list of games that do this gameplay style much better. For example, in other dungeon crawlers, there's always a home base of sorts where you can sell your items and better equip yourself. This makes for a cool pattern of getting as far as you can in a dungeon and then heading back into town so you can sell what you found so far, which will allow you to buy more healing items and weapons so you can get further into a dungeon. In Book of Memories, functions like saving and buying items are limited to rooms found in each randomly generated dungeon, and in some ways this is a much better setup. This means heading into a shop and trading in some equipment doesn't require you to leave the dungeon and reset all your progress, which is a pretty convenient way to tackle that specific problem. The only issue is that dungeons are randomly generated, so these rooms may be conveniently placed at the beginning of an area or sometimes right at the very end. And trust me, there will be times when having one healing item on you will mean the difference between finishing a zone or looking at a game over screen. If you want my opinion, this game could have been a lot more fair if the story beats, shop, and save functions were available outside of the dungeon, or maybe placed in a constant location inside one. Also, an RPG fan will probably want to jump headfirst into customizing stats and leveling up, but even something as simple as a numerical EXP gauge is missing, and I gotta assume this was done for simplicity's sake. Sure, there is a meter you can look at, but there's no way to know how much EXP you actually have or how much killing a specific enemy will net you. On top of that, the game is essentially built on a system of managing the stats of your character, artifacts, and weapons, but in a really stupid move didn't include any accessible way to view weapon stats. The only place that I found that would tell me how strong a weapon is comes from the short dialogue window that pops up when you complete one of Valtail's submissions. Other than this, there is no way I found to view vital stats like how strong an item is or how much durability it has. This seems like a really hard idea to mess up. I mean, it's RPG Gaming 101. You included a system that relies on these stats. Why in the hell would they not be something the player can be aware of at any point? But really and truly, it doesn't matter what systems work or don't work, because at the end of the day, Book of Memories is just, well, it's kind of boring. At first, I did enjoy the combat and the cycle of finding new weapons and artifacts, but after the second or third dungeon, there just wasn't enough variation to keep me engaged. Honestly, playing through one of this game's dungeons and maybe fighting one of its bosses will give you the entire experience wrapped up in a nice little box. You'll see literally everything the game has to offer, and you'll only spend, I don't know, but 20 minutes maybe? Just understand what you experience in that 20 minutes will be stretched out across 20 hours and repeated ad nauseum. However, this isn't the worst issue you're going to come across. In keeping with Konami's decree that the game should showcase all of the Vita's features, an uncomfortable amount of gameplay functions are mapped to the portable's touchscreen. And on the actual console, this isn't a giant deal. Sure, assigning actual in-game button presses to these functions would have made them far more satisfying and easy to use, but It's not exactly the worst example of this on the Vita. However, I needed to capture footage of myself playing this game, which meant I needed to use the PS TV, a kind of consoleized PS Vita. With this, the touch functions are mapped to either clicking the analog sticks or using the PS4's touch bar, and neither of these solutions work particularly well in my opinion. Clicking the analog stick will make it so that stick controls an on-screen cursor and not your character, so if you need to use a healing item in the heat of a fight, you're essentially a sitting duck until you click on it. The touch bar is a little better in some ways since I can still move my character around avoiding attacks while I go to use a health pack or tool. The only issue with this method is it can be hella awkward to stretch your right hand over to the touch bar, and when you do, actually clicking it in can shift your cursor away from what you were trying to click on in the first place. On top of that, this game has some liberal ideas of what constitutes whether or not an icon is being clicked on. I mean, look at this, you can see I'm clearly clicking well inside what you would assume the activation area would be, but nothing's happening. I feel like it wouldn't have been too hard to increase the area around these icons that indicate a successful press. Thanks to this, instead of using a tool about half of the time, I accidentally closed the on-screen backpack. Something that wasn't too much of an issue early on, but as the difficulty climbs, this can be more and more of a death sentence. And surprise, surprise, the difficulty is another issue of mine. For about the first 3 or 4 hours, the game has a pretty fair challenge, but heading towards the last and second to last story dungeon, the difficulty curve turns into a 90-degree angle, which required me to grind more, which meant engaging in the boring act of demolishing hundreds of low-level monsters just to move my EXP meter about 1/4 of a millimeter. And in the end, even though it's sad to say, this game just wasn't fun for me. I won't say it started strong, but it had promise in the beginning. The thought of running through these dungeons, collecting loot, and ripping into enemies I knew so well was legitimately motivating, but without any real reason to do that and no real changes in the core gameplay after tens of hours, well, I just got burnt out. Early on, I just stopped having fun. I got to the point where the only drive I had to pick it up from day to day was to get footage for this video. And just when I would make a crazy amount of progress in a zone and I would feel kind of satisfied, I would die just because I stepped on a trap tile that took away all of my HP but one. And call me crazy, but that feels a little outside of my control as a player. But despite me complaining a pretty heavy amount so far, I wouldn't necessarily call this a bad game. More than anything, it's just kind of bland, which really sucks because unlike a lot of other SH fans, I think the idea of a dungeon crawler set in the Silent Hill universe sounds like an amazingly cool idea. I honestly feel like there's nothing wrong with spin-offs that play with the genre established in the mainline series, but Book of Memory falls short of that potential with a few really bad game design choices and the limitations that were forced on the devs by Konami, of course. I wouldn't say this is one you should avoid per se. After all, there were moments of fun in my playthrough. The rush of leveling up or finding a new weapon that allowed me to steamroll an area that was giving me problems really tapped into my brain's pleasure center, but the total package just doesn't keep that up very long. I would say it might be at least worth a look for those of you that are curious, but after seeing the insane prices copies of this game go for on the used market, I can confidently say it is not worth it. If you want my opinion, just go download the demo from the Vita's PSN store and you'll get a majority of the experience you would have had with the full game, but with the added bonus of not spending the 20 hours it took me to come to this conclusion. So don't ever say I don't do anything for you guys. It may not be common knowledge, but the Vita was actually a powerful little handheld, one that probably needed a few more years of R&D. The console itself was actually capable of great performance, but the mobile form factor limited elements like cooling, causing the console to essentially nerf itself. That being said, Book of Memories has a relatively interesting look to it, with features like reflective surfaces and some simple normal map textures, but I'm more excited to talk about how I got the footage you're looking at right now. For those of you that didn't keep up during the Vita's time in the spotlight, the console itself, unlike the PSP that came before it, wasn't actually capable of video output. Sony would soon fix this issue with a PlayStation TV, which was essentially a Vita but lacking the screen and speakers. This turned the portable into an honest-to-goodness home console, and I'm always interested in playing portable titles on the big screen. Sadly, my hopes of a full Vita home console would be dashed somewhat when I found out the PS TV only allows certain titles to be played thanks to a lack of touchscreen features on a traditional controller. And even more egregious than that is the blurry bilinear filtered picture that the Vita outputs. Topping out at a max of 720p if you want progressive scan output, this isn't exactly what I would call pretty. Now, it's definitely not the worst looking picture, and for the longest time, it's the only method we had, but luckily that has all changed recently. What you're seeing here is the result of two very interesting hacks, mainly the PSTV anti-blacklist to enable Book of Memories to even play on the console, and a cool little piece of homebrew called Sharp Scale, which allows for much better looking video output than a stock PSTV is capable of. Before we get too far into that though, you're going to need some form of the Henkaku custom firmware installed before you're able to take advantage of these apps, but thanks to a wealth of guides here on YouTube and Sony dropping support and updates for the PS Vita, this is a problem easily remedied. Opening up Sharp Scale, we have some really interesting options to mess around with. Under scaling mode, Original will just use the PSTV's regular scaled video output. Integer will perform a sharper integer scale, making sure all pixels display at an even height and width, aka my favorite way to go. And then there's Real Mode, which lets you see a Vita game's base resolution windowed within the output resolution of the PSTV. Honestly, it's really cool getting a look at the individual resolutions certain Vita games render at internally. And Fitted will essentially perform the same job as the regular scaling mode, but a little more accurately. For the scaling algorithm, I would recommend the point option, which is much sharper, but some people might also like the softer look of the bilinear scale. This only applies if you're not using an integer scale, so you may not even have to worry about this. And it is important to note that this app is going to perform differently depending on your system's output resolution. Normally I'd recommend using its 720p output along with Sharp Scale's integer scaling option for a smaller but progressive scan image. Sure, the extra pixels of 1080i would be nice, but if you're capturing footage like me, the combing artifacts that'll show up thanks to the interlaced picture might ruin the look of your captured footage. But if you've come to love my absolute video snobbery, don't you worry, that is still going on. I have my PSTV's HDMI output going into my FrameMeister, and I'm letting it apply its adaptive deinterlacing. It's certainly not a perfect option, since you will have likely noticed that scenes with a lot of quick movement will still show some of those combing artifacts, but I just like the added sharpness of the picture, and I have it, so why not be as ridiculous as possible? To get that 1080i integer scale, a few lines of resolution have to be sacrificed on the top and bottom of the screen, but I didn't find that to be an issue with any of the games I tested. Using Sharp Scale, we can really get a good look at what Book of Memories has to offer, and for a portable title, it's pretty damn impressive. There are issues where the shininess of the normal map floor and background textures combine with your flashlight to create a glaring amount of light, but this only happens in a few areas. Enemies are actually a little more detailed than I would have expected given the zoomed out nature of the game's camera, and while slowdown does show up from time to time, I never felt like it negatively impacted the gameplay. The game's intro cutscene does this really great job of showing off a world outside the nightmare that the dungeons take place in, and I wish this was something we saw more. Throughout the game, you'll only ever get to see your character in the nightmare world. This intro is the only time we get to see the real world, and this is a real missed opportunity. Just being able to navigate our apartment would have given the nightmare a lot more context, and it would have felt a little more foreign and interesting for it. There are a few sparse times when you'll see the camera zoom in, mostly in these weird ghost story rooms, and I wish we would have seen this a little more too. Watching the developers show off early builds of the game lets us see what could have been with a closer camera and a more traditional Silent Hill look. And damn do I wish this was the game we got. I mean, what we're looking at right now isn't what I would call ugly or anything, but god would I kill to see what the Vita could have done with the established look of the series. Each weapon in the game is pretty good looking, and they're all visually distinct, which is good for a game with a camera this far away from the action. At the end of each zone, you'll fight a boss monster, and while they all look relatively cool, there's only one that seems to fit in with the style we've come to expect from SH monsters. The heads-up display is probably my only real complaint as far as presentation goes. It's just way too cluttered, and in zones with really huge dungeons, the minimap can take up a majority of your screen. Of course, having this map on screen is very important with the complex and randomized nature of the dungeons, but it's also sharing real estate with your on-screen items, health bar, keys, key items, and alignment meter. Without a doubt, the touchscreen features that WayForward were forced to incorporate definitely explain the cluttered, busy feeling of the OSD, but since we're already shitting things up, I feel like it would have been really easy to add an EXP meter just under your health bar. I mean, you did make a game where grinding was the goal. I would think making it easier to grind would be a top priority. If only this game used the Vita's select button to bring up an item selector or something, a solid chunk of this clutter could have been done away with, but like I've said a million times by now, that's not exactly something we can pin on WayForward. Heading back into some negatives, every character in this game besides the mailman and your avatar exist in the world as either a series of text prompts or an illustration on a loading screen, and this just did not work for me. To be honest, it just felt lazy, especially in a series world-renowned for its amazing storytelling. I mean, it would have been really easy to have characters visibly represented in the game world through scripted cutscenes like in the intro. That would have totally solved this issue. I totally understand that there is a chance this could have been done to save on space, but more than anything, I feel like this was a move done out of laziness or maybe time constraints. Either way, I do not like it. Taking all of this into consideration, I just don't know how to feel about Book of Memories' presentation. There's a lot of impressive effects going on, like the simulated look of rain falling on the ground and an okay looking lighting system, but there were a lot of cut corners and bad design ideas at play as well. Without a doubt, there are things in this game that impress me, but I just don't know if I'm cutting the game slack due to its portable nature. It seems like areas where a lot of attention was paid, like the intro cutscene, kind of cast a shadow on all the spots that they slacked on, but I'm not sure it's realistic to expect SH3 levels of care for a top-down dungeon crawler. I guess with all this flip-flopping, what I'm trying to say is come in with realistic expectations and you'll likely find some stuff you like. You just may need to dig through a lot of stuff you don't like to find it.
Well, I suppose I'm a lot of things.
Let me guess. You're also the fire marshal, the mayor, the chief of police.
Not exactly.
Well, I don't really know what to say here. I honestly think this project had potential. I'm not sure why, but something about this genre feels like it would have made a great combination with Silent Hill, but that just is not the case we're dealing with, both thanks to stipulations made by Konami and what I have to assume is either console limitations or developer laziness. Elements that would have made Book of Memories much more tolerable just aren't present. While it does feel great using a PS4 controller to play this game on a much larger display, the touchscreen controls leave a lot to be desired, to say the least. Sure, some of that's on me since I'm technically playing a game that shouldn't work on the console, but even on the actual Vita, there are a lot of issues with these touchscreen controls. I don't know, Book of Memories had this amazing potential, but at the end of the day, I just didn't want to play it. The loop of leveling up, doing better, running into a brick wall, and leveling up again typically works with me, but this game just didn't offer enough variety to make this feel fun. And when your dungeon crawler makes grinding annoying, well, I think you've missed the point of a dungeon crawler. Maybe check this one out for the sheer spectacle of it, but other than that, I can say that this was easily one of the most frustrating experiences I've had covering a Silent Hill game, second only to Downpour, of course. Well guys, thanks for walking with me down this oddly interesting detour. We only have 2 more titles left to go over until this little retrospective is through, and both are going to require, well, let's say a different approach. But until then, I hope I'll see all of you guys again right here on the Silent Hill Retrospective. Yo, what's up guys? Thanks very much for jumping down another one of these long winding rabbit holes with me. If you're looking for more Silent Hill coverage, I'll have some videos linked on screen for you, and if you want to support this little endeavor of mine, I'll have a link to my Patreon. Now, of course, I can't legally say that everyone who joins gets a kiss from me, but, you know, read in between the lines.